and welcome to the Chez podcast on Paris Underground Radio.
I'm Emily Monaco, fungus expert and professional consumer of cheese.
And I'm your resident wine expert, Caroline Connor.
And we both live in France, where wine and cheese are cornerstones of almost every meal, from the day-to-day to the extraordinary.
At Chez, we feature recipes submitted by home cooks like you and pair them with the perfect wine and the most complimentary cheese.
This week's recipe comes to us from Forrest Collins, Paris's foremost cocktail expert and the founder of 52 Martinis, an app and website guiding you to Paris's cocktail scene. She's calling in with a bit of a stumper, her version of pad thai, and she's hoping for an awesome cheese and wine pairing to combine with all of these complex flavors.
Hello, Caroline and Emily. It's Forrest, as you know, from 52 Martinis, and I'm sending you both a little recipe challenge so you can tell me how to pair this with wine and cheese. My recipe challenge for you is pad thai. As you know, I like cocktails, right? I write about them, I drink them, I make them, I do all kinds of activities around cocktails, and I have for a long time. But there's some similarities for me between cocktails and Thai food. A bajillion years ago, before living in Paris, I lived in Seattle. And there's a lot of good Thai food in Seattle. Where I lived on Lower Queen Anne, I could just walk to a couple of really great places and have some pad thai. And it was kind of comfort food for me and really easy to find. When I moved to Paris like 20 years ago, it wasn't really that easy to find good Thai food, or at least not what I was used to, what I considered good Thai food. So eventually I decided to learn how to make my own pad thai. So I went through, I looked online, I did a lot of tweaking, a recipe that I found off of Chez, her recipe. I've gone to Thailand and I took a cooking class there. One of the dishes I learned to make was pad thai. So I'm really happy with my pad thai now. And I don't go out for Thai food very often in Paris, even though there's a lot more options now. But, I really had to kind of take matters into my own hands to be able to get what it was that I appreciated from my life before Paris. That is also how I got into cocktails, right? Well, also how I got into the blogging, all these other things around cocktails. I really liked cocktails when I lived in the US. When I went out to bars, I would get mixed drinks. Even though Seattle has a really great beer culture, even back, 2 decades ago, there was lots of really good craft beers. I usually wanted a mixed drink or a cocktail. So fast forward to, Seattle to moving to Paris, and there's a lot of really good things to drink in Paris, right? Like there's wine and wine and wine. I mean, the domestic wine is great and it's cheap. So for a few years, I kind of forgot about cocktails. But, after a couple of years, I really missed having access to great cocktails, and when friends would come over, they'd ask about them, or when I travel, I would see them everywhere. So much like my search for pad thai and finding a way to be able to get it here, I decided to do a little search for cocktails, and thus 52 Martinis was born. So every week I would go and look for a place, and et cetera, et cetera. So I went, we kind of all know this isn't about the history of 52 Martinis, but the whole idea was also with cocktails. I loved them from before I was here. I came here, I couldn't find what I wanted. So I really spent a lot of time trying to be able to access and get what I wanted here in Paris from my life before Paris. So, they're both a little bit similar in that way. And here's another similarity that I find between cocktails and Thai food. The 3 legs of the cocktail stool are basically strong, sweet, and sour. You've usually got, a citrus element, you got a sweet element from, some kind of a liqueur or a simple syrup, and you're strong, which is your spirit. So the key to making a really good cocktail is balancing those 3 things. And when you've got Thai food, it's kind of similar, because I would say the 3 legs of the stool for Thai food are sweet, sour, and spicy. So, you can kind of sweet and sour, those translate directly, and you can kind of think of spicy as you think of strong. So I think a really good Thai dish has to be a balance of sort of the same elements that you get in a cocktail. So that's my kind of background on pad thai. But I really didn't bring that up just because it reminds me, because there's similarities for me between, what I really love and do a lot of and pad thai. I brought it to you because it's really hard to pair with. It's hard to pair wine with, and it's hard to pair cheese with. Now, for a little background, so you know what you're pairing with, my pad thai is a pretty standard recipe. It's rice noodles, it's a sauce made with fish sauce, palm sugar, tamarind paste, and I put in a little spicy curry paste, which gives it some heat, garlic, fresh garlic chopped up, spring onions, coriander, a couple of eggs, and then, I use bean sprouts, but I don't get too precious about that. Sometimes when I'm out in the country, I just can't find bean sprouts. So sometimes I just use those bags of the shredded carrots and cabbage, which are kind of nice and make for a little fun, fresh twist on my pad thai. But anyway, so there you've got it. You've got kind of a sweet and sour and spicy noodle dish over some veggie kind of things. So I am calling on your expertise to tell me, how can I pair some wine and some cheese with that? And with that, I'll say thank you for inviting me to share a recipe and get some pairing suggestions from you.
Thank you so much, Forrest, for sharing that recipe. I love Thai food. And until recently, I've lived in Paris, for 14 years now. And until recently, there was no really great Thai food here. It was something that I felt like I had to either make at home, which always seemed really, really daunting, or else eat it whenever I went back to New York. So I'm glad to have a lovely pad Thai recipe in my back pocket now. I don't know, Caroline, are you into Thai food?
I'm into all food.
So, Thai food is super well balanced in and of itself. And so it's hard to think, for me, at least in my case, of following all those flavors, that freshness and sweetness and acidity, with anything too in your face, and with anything dairy based. This feels like a big challenge. I know that there's not a ton of traditional cheese in Thailand, but I did do a bit of research when I was thinking about this one, and I discovered there's actually a Thai cheesemaker making some French style cheese in Nakhon Pathom. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. Her name is Kai Srikong, and she's making brie-style cheeses, among others. And so I thought that was kind of cool that she's, figured out a way to make some local cheeses with French techniques in Thailand.
That's awesome. That's so fun.
Yeah. So, brie is obviously delicious, but it feels a little too funky to follow this dish with all of its, the perfect pad thai has the ideal balance of sweet and salty and sour, and you have all of that going on, and then to follow it with a cheese almost feels like really you're going to throw rich cheese on top of all of that freshness. But it did get me thinking about, okay, well, what direction can we go in this? And I found out that this cheesemaker in Thailand found out, did the research, did the actual genetic research to find out that there's a local variety of Thai goats whose milk can be made into cheese. And so it got me thinking about goat cheese and sort of those fresh, herbaceous kind of grassy notes that you get in a really good French goat cheese, which tends to be less overtly sour than an American goat cheese. I think of a Vermont goat cheese, and I'm okay, that's got a lot of sour kick to it. And this is going to be sort of more muted, more herbaceous. And so for this, I decided to go with something super simple, which is a croûte de chèvre. So that's a little tiny goat cheese from the Loire Valley. It's relatively mild in flavor. It's got kind of a nuttiness. It's got kind of a grassy quality to it. And it does have a little bit of that sort of acidity. So the combination of those sort of three flavors following a pad thai, you're not going to end on something that's way too lactic, way too creamy. You end on something still a little light, still a little bright, and that won't kind of overpower your palate after you've had that wonderful blend of a combination of different flavors. So that's kind of where I was going.
I love that. I think that makes sense. And goat cheese has this grassy thing and complexity and acidity that I think can stand up to that.
Yeah. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now back to Chez. What were you thinking in terms of a wine to go with this? Because I bet that pairing a wine with pad thai must be a fun task for you.
Honestly, a lot of wine can go with this. I think I'm probably going to stick with white because it's less likely to fight with anything on this list. We have a lot going on. I would think of something herbaceous, and with you bringing up goat cheese, I would actually say that a nice Sauvignon Blanc would be great. Maybe a Sancerre.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be fantastic. That's going to be really crisp and minerally, cut through some of the richness, but it's also going to stand up a little bit to, it's going to have the grassy thing. It has that grassy freshness that I think you get a lot through cilantro, coriander, and something a little bit, citrusy as well. I mean, or you could even go for something like an Australian Riesling that has a lot of lime character to it. That would be really good. Something with good acidity to balance out just all of the wonderful flavors there. And yeah, I think we could have a few options, but often, especially in Western kind of wine canon, we try to pair sweeter wines with quote unquote Asian food. So it does work well. I think you could totally go with a sweeter Riesling from Germany, or even something like a Gewürztraminer that's really aromatic. But I think for these kind of pairings, an aromatic white is really a good way to go.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about a Gewürztraminer because I've never done a pairing with pad thai, but I know that with Thai curry, I often do a Gewürztraminer. Yeah, why do you think that we like the sweeter wines with like the quote unquote Asian sort of cuisines?
Well, the thing about, this recipe and in general is that there is sugar in the dish, and you do generally want to have sugary, some sugar in your wine if there's sugar in your food, because sugar in your food will make the wine taste sour otherwise. So that is legit. But otherwise, I mean, I think, a California Pinot could be really nice. That isn't super tannic. We don't really want it to fight with shrimp or fish sauce, but something that might have a little bit of residual sugar in it. Something, Central Coast Pinot. There's so many options. It's hard for me to pair one thing with a dish like this. But if you were in France and you have French wine, you could definitely just go for a Sancerre. I think that'd be delightful. Or a Gewürztraminer or a Riesling from Alsace.
When I'm looking at this dish, I'm actually interested to have your perspective on something. I interviewed years and years ago the chef Han Pao Kuchang, who is he's Canadian born. He is of Romanian and Chinese descent, and he used to be the chef at a really amazing cocktail bar and small plates place here in Paris called the Mary Celeste. And I was interviewing him about kind of his approach to cooking for a French palate. And he said to me that he finds that, because French food and a lot of European cuisines grew up having wine as like a constant associated flavor, that often there was like less balanced acidity in the dishes because you were looking for that acidity in the wine. And that was why it made it more difficult to pair wine with Asian cuisines, which didn't have that wine sort of addition to it. What do you think about that? Does that ring true for you?
I don't know. I think that there is acidity in a lot of Asian dishes. Right. And what wine brings to cooking is generally acidity and, a little bit of complexity. I think it's more just cultural and just the fact that there's been, less wine culture in that part of the world historically. And people tend to, enjoy spirits and beer more often and other fermented stuff. But, there's so many different wines in the world. I think you can really pair wine with anything. And I think people really want to be like, this is what goes with this. But, any dish could be good with a number of wines.
Yeah, absolutely.
And any wine can pair with a lot of different foods. So
cool. And it's also kind of fun just in that nerdy way of having Sancerre with that Crottin de Chavignon too. If the Sancerre works with the food, and then it's also kind of working with a cheese that comes from the same area, which Absolutely. Is always, rule of thumb if you're feeling lazy and trying to come up with a wine and cheese pairing is try and find something from the same region, and it'll usually work out okay.
What grows together goes together.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. But, obviously, and we're talking to Forrest Collins, who is a famous cocktail blogger and cocktail enthusiast. And she, I think she would probably drink it with a cocktail, which would be great too,
Exactly.
So we'll have to get Forrest to tell us.
Yeah, we'll have to get her to, because that's something we're seeing more and more of. In Paris and Afar is, pairing food with cocktails, which is a totally different ballgame, I guess.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. There's a place in my neighborhood that does it too. And it's really fun. It's really fun to see how much people can play and be creative in that way.
Well, thank you so much, Forrest, for sharing Forrest. your recipe with us. And anybody who wants to throw us another curveball, something that you think might not pair super well with wine or with cheese, we're game. Let us know what we can try and pair for you.
Yes, please torture us.
Please do. We love torture.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Cheers.
To learn more about the recipe featured today and to see photos of the meal, please go to parisundergroundradio.com.
To have your recipe featured in an upcoming episode of Chez, please email us at parisundergroundradio@gmail.com.
You can find me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Instagram and Twitter.
And you can find me, Caroline Connor, at Wine Dine Caroline on all the things.
This episode was produced by Paris Underground Radio. The music is A Night Alone by Track Tribe.
For more about the Chez podcast and podcasts like it, please go to parisundergroundradio.com.
Thanks for listening, and bon appetit!